Hi everyone, we're here at Mutant Watch the Mutants on Facebook and Twitter, and I'm Duna, and we're here with Nick, Matt, Gabriel, and Travis. Okay, so follow us on Twitter and on Facebook on the direction below, and visit Comic Watch for reviews and other things. And before we begin the program, I want to give a shout out to the Black Lives Matter protests that are happening right now, and for everyone to help in the capacity that they can. Like, if you can't go to protests, they are in this link that is right there, Black Lives Matters .carrd.co, and you can find there several ways of helping, like helping protesters, like if you are going to a protest, or donation, petition links, and etc. And also we'll be posting later on Facebook and Twitter some other ways to help that are very underhelped right now, links that need more sharing, in case you want to take a look at that. And we encourage everyone to get involved in the way they can, since this is like one of the most important protests since probably Stonewall or the civil rights movement. So that's the thing we like to highlight here, and we support fully. If anyone wants to add anything about that.
You pretty much covered it. It's important, and we all need to support it.
Absolutely. Comic Watch is officially 100% behind Black Lives Matter all the way. So that's where we stand, full stop.
Okay, so the show of today is gonna go about gender and sexuality in the X-Men. We're gonna focus on a lot of LGBT issues and how they relate to the comics we love, to the comics we have been reading, and to the whole run of the X-Men that has been going since the 60s, especially since the 80s. It has been a huge theme for LGBT plus fans. And I want to ask any one of our members, what do they think? Like, how did you relate to the dance of gender and sexuality in the X-Men? What's the way you have to see and how it treats those things? And anyone that wants to go first?
Okay, I'll go first. Why not? So just to make sure I understand the question, we're talking about pretty much how we relate to how gender and sexuality is presented in the X-Men, right? To be honest, for an extremely long time, I didn't relate at all, because of a lot of it was subtext, and I'm not a very big subtexty person. It goes right over my head. I'm not bright like that. So for me, it didn't really connect until Peter David's X Factor. Seeing a queer Hispanic mutant open completely changed how I related to the X-Men from the bottom up. It was just a complete eye-opening moment for me. I think I spent so long thinking that queer issues didn't have a place in comic books, so I didn't even recognize that it was missing until I saw that it was there, and it could be there, and it should be there.
Okay, anyone else? Maybe Travis or Nick want to go over the questions?
I'd actually like to follow up on that because I'm somewhat in the same boat. It wasn't something that I just picked up on immediately and it was like, this is what I'm reading this for. The subtext on a lot of things, and there's probably a lot of things I'm going to talk about in this episode, I was really into it, and then looking back I was like, oh, now I see. Like, it was things that it takes a little bit to read more into, but I think that explains the importance of, like, what we talked about in the first episode with the X-Men metaphor, or the mutant metaphor, and what it means for disenfranchised communities, and how it can be applicable to all these different ways and all these different struggles of identifying with it. And it just provides so much depth for it. And I'm just a fan of, Wolverine slashing people with claws as a teenager, and then you start getting a little older and reading more into it, and there's a lot more to be found.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Travis, why don't you go ahead? I tend to be long-winded.
Yeah, sure. I mean, for me, it was a big thing very early on. When I was young, I was having surgeries related to being intersex, and for some other issues. And I used to get comics after, like, hanging out in the hospital in recovery, and you read comics. And so at the time in the 80s, Marvel especially was really homoerotic. If you read X-Men comics, it was, Magic and Kitty, and it was, you had over Defenders. And Defenders at the time was basically an X-Men comic because you had 3 of the founding X-Men in there. And they had a romance going on between Iceman and Cloud, who sometimes was male presenting, sometimes female presenting, and also romantically connected to another character, which was Moondragon. And there were arguments in the comic over, like, Iceman would get pissed off because they would be kissing or whatever, and Cloud would turn into a guy or present as a guy. And Iceman would have kind of a, no, this is, you're making me uncomfortable. And the other characters would call him on it. And, I've talked to Peter Gillis, who was the writer, about that at the time. And he said, very intentional, and him kind of working through things as one of his friends transitioned. But that spoke to me in a big way. I don't like the Kitty Colossus thing. You'll never sell me on. But I love every one of Kitty's girlfriends, and that was that was the thing for me. Like, I didn't want to date Kitty as a kid. I wasn't interested when she was with a guy, but, as soon as she was with Rachel or she was with Magic in a scene, that meant something to me. Like that, I kind of had an idea there. That related more to what I saw in reality. We have a lot of queer people in my family. It was never like a hidden thing that way. And you didn't see it on TV at the time. You didn't see it in other areas of entertainment. So for me, comics kind of was where that was at.
I think that's so awesome that you that you were able to find something so profoundly relatable in comics on that level, which probably went over a lot of people's heads, Travis, to be perfectly honest. And the fact that even at a young age you were able to intuit what you were reading and relate to it is really awesome. And it says a lot about the power of the X-Men and the mutant metaphor in general, which I missed that conversation due to technical issues. But for me, I kind of come at it from a different angle, because when I was a kid, and I'll be completely transparent and even a little vulnerable here. When I was a kid, I was always on my own, always punked and bullied, just because I didn't fit in for one reason or another socially. And when I found safe haven in comics, it was immediately the X-Men that I connect to, because they're outsiders, and they are who they are. And as I got older, and that sense of being on the outside and personally downtrodden led me to connect more strongly to minority rights, civil rights, and trans rights, whatever. I started taking up those causes myself, because in the other downtrodden among society, I saw reflections of myself, and I still do. And so for me, the idea of the X-Men being this bastion for queer representation or Black excellence, or anything that you want to speak to of minority representation, is just a natural extension. I mean, there's no better place in comics to have LGBTQ characters, and I just love that, and it just speaks to me profoundly on a lot of different levels.
So picking up on that, I really identified in some ways with Travis' story, because for me, reading X-Men was a lot of the ways I discovered a lot of things about myself. I'm pretty sure that I discovered I was a girl reading comics. I'm pretty sure that was like a big part of my moment of being like, I relate to all these girls characters and I don't relate to any other boy characters. That must be like a casualty of something, but there's something there that like was calling me a lot, and I was fascinated by characters that broke like that gender norm stuff. I mostly Mystique, which I'm gonna talk about certainly later, but also like Rogue or like Dazzler or like characters that were like in that spectrum of like at least gender appearance fluidity, which is something that I have always struggled with, like being a trans girl, but also being a girl that doesn't want to be especially feminine, or like that I don't identify with that part of it. And it's like, I think the first time that I got an idea that was relate somewhat closely to that was reading the X-Men comics, because I was seeing a lot of people that were just weirdos and that was like things that are not possible in real life, but at the same time they have this like connection, like this super homoerotic and bonds with one another. I'm thinking maybe about Rane and Munster and Daniel Munster have this very like bond where they're literally soulmates. Like the word is soulmates, and that was like big to me, because also Rane was a character I was very attached to, because she literally turns into a wolf and she's scared of that. And there's this conflict that you can relate to a lot of things, and it's not explicitly anything. And this is something that I think we're gonna touch more, that a lot of these things are there but not like explicitly there, but like the authors wanted to be there but the editors did not want it or something, and finally are like half there, more or less saying. And well, I still love that they were there, but also the fact that they were not explicit was like keeping me from like being like, I'm this and I'm proud and I'm open about it. And that's something that comics need and that X-Men didn't always have. So I have that very like, I don't know how to say it, but like weird relationship, complicated relationship, where I love it, but at the same time, kind of hate how it was like keeping everything under a blanket.
Yeah, it kind of showed that, hey, it's okay to be like this, but while at the same time showing, hey, don't say you're like this, just keep it quiet. It really presents this conflicted message if you look at the old comics, because it's all kind of hush-hushed.
Well, and Nightcrawler in particular in those older comics, you know, he can't just go out in public as himself. He goes out in public, you know, uses an image inducer to look like a white guy with blonde hair. Excuse me. So yeah, I get that. It's impressive to see though how far we've come in terms of understanding what proper representation means in that time, and it's important too.
Yeah, I think that's kind of where a lot of my interest in this subject is right now, because there's this strange influence happening where the X-Men, represent this pursuit against disenfranchisement, and they're also facing that in the creative and editorial decisions, while that's happening. So it's almost this compounded struggle that you're seeing take place in the books, and I think that kind of comes through in the frustration that there's not a lot that is just like out there and very steadfast in their statement. It's always hidden behind subtext and nuance.
Well, we're still waiting on so many confirmations on panel or first kisses, and it's weird to be waiting for a first kiss if characters have been around for 20 years or 40 years. But that's where we're at as comics fans. We're stuck there.
Yeah, like the first kiss of Destiny and Mystique was last year.
Yeah.
Like that's like we've been new, but the first kiss was like last year. It's like, okay, so talking on to like concrete characters, I wanna ask every one of you what's your favorite. And I'm gonna go from different places with this question. Like, I think there's different ways to look at it. But the first one is your favorite explicit LGBT plus X-Men character. It can be subtext for now. It can be implicit, because I think for now, then we open it. But I think it's a good way to start to look at concrete characters that have overcome that barrier of not talking about this that we're touching on later. So who wants to start? Who has a character in mind?
I mean, I can start this one. I have a character, like I'm working on kind of the history and evolution of Wolverine right now, so I'm excited in that. And Wolverine's not really the choice, but James Howlett in Extreme X-Men is the character. I think if you're gonna break the mold, that's how you do it. It's heavy mask Wolverine with huge, even bigger Hercules, and I think that on-panel kiss also is something to what Travis had mentioned that we're kind of still waiting on. They do these things and then never follow up on them. But it's still what I want to see out of something like Wolverine. And I think that panel always just stands out in that character because they follow up with it almost immediately of the astonishing X-Men Wolverine like standing over his shoulder as he's grieving for Hercules. And there's this weird dichotomy happening, and I'm just so here for that. I think it's a great example of, what can be done if it's followed through correctly.
Well, I'll go next. I'm going to throw the obvious one out there, Iceman, because when he was outed / came out, whichever definition you prefer for that particular issue. I've read multiple interpretations of it, and I don't want to necessarily be the one to weigh in on it. But it just felt so organic. It's like there was this elephant in the room the whole time. And with his string of failed romances and his outsized alpha bro personality, it was just like, hey, this guy's actually been repressing quite a lot, and I loved it, and it's been embraced since then, and it hasn't, to my knowledge, it hasn't been walked back, and so I just really like it. It also pulls at a little bit of a thread at the all the way at the original X-Men #1, all the way back in 1963, when all the other guys at the school are interested in this new student, Jean Grey, and he just walks off and he's like, whatever, it's just a girl, and it's been there. Like Travis was saying, there's a lot of stuff that's just hanging out there, and it's even low-hanging fruit. And somebody finally just had the common sense to say, yeah, obviously Iceman's gay. So totally down for that.
Kind of going off with the low-hanging fruit part, Richter and Shatterstar is something that is so obvious there if you read the X Factor, that bromance is a little bit too mancy and less bro-y if you're really paying attention. But no one really wanted to commit and make it happen until Peter David did an X Factor. And it was something that if you read the comic as it was coming out, he would reference it, particularly in the letters page, how people wanted it to happen. That he said that the biggest question he was getting for a while was, when would Richter's ex Shatterstar show up, and when would Siren's ex Deadpool show up? And he was aware that the fans wanted it, and the way that he did it, I felt, was done so well. It wasn't, hey, we can do this. It was, hey, this has been happening. We just haven't showed it on panel yet. They were kind of set up to have been this pre-established relationship that drifted apart for whatever reason, and now we're back together. And even in the dialogue earlier in that series, Richter wasn't really so much in the closet as just not talking about it. He has a few conversations with Multiple Man where they make comments about Shatterstar and even Richter maybe being attracted to Pietro, and it's something that has stuck through with the comics as to Richter and his bad choice in evil men who help him and him automatically trusting him. And it adds nuance to the character that I felt was lacking.
I think also on the Iceman part of it, I think Iceman has tried to come out multiple times and they never let him. And that's like part of the story about why this was so organic. It was like this was not Bendy's idea. This was the idea of a lot of writers that weren't allowed to do so multiple times until they decided, no, right now, yes. But I remember I have read multiple interviews to Claremont saying he intended to do Iceman gay. And I also remember, well, in the case of Claremont, I'm not sure if he intended to do Iceman gay or bisexual. It's not clear in the interviews. But I also remember that Scott Lobdell wrote a comic in which I think it's Uncanny X-Men 315, maybe? I don't know, one of those numbers, 300 or something. Scott Lobdell wrote a coming out story for Iceman that was on panel, and I was like, done. Like, if you read the pages, it's a coming out story. He's talking to Rogue, he's trying to break up with Rogue, which happens later, and he's like, I have this darkest secret, and my father doesn't consider me enough of a man, and etc., etc. Like, the dialogue is pretty much leading into it, but the editors say, but what if you don't say gay? And he was like, okay. So then it just landed nowhere. It's very obvious when you read the issue that it just landed nowhere. Like, what's the secret Iceman has? What's that dark secret? And it was something about his powers lately, just to fix it up. But it was clear that that was not the main intention.
And that was issue 319, Dune. I was able to check the message you sent me a few weeks ago.
Okay, that one. Thank you, Gabriel. So, okay. And then Marjorie Liu also tried to do that. Marjorie Liu came to Marvel saying, I want to make Iceman come out. I would add, like, finally. And then Marvel said, oh, well, no. And then she wrote the full story of Iceman not being content with any of his relationship with girls, which is the whole run is about that. And then it was like about his depression finally, which is a really interesting point, but it's like clearly a depression because he can't come out. And well, I think that one of the ways because that is organic is because he's a character that a lot of people look at and say, well, I'm LGBT and I identify with how this character relates to this straight war. And a lot of writers try to do that, but none of them did. Until...
Well, I think, like, you know, even back in the early 80s and maybe the 70s, when you would have Iceman get jealous of someone like Angel, and he would just lie and say, I'm his boyfriend, Lance. To run off girls. Like, that was a running gag that anytime people didn't know who Bobby Drake was gay. And we all have seen that, whether it was us or it was someone we know. There's someone who, when they're in their hometown or they're at the store where all their friends are at, they're one way. And the minute that they have some kind of freedom, some kind of buffer, there's a whole other thing that comes out. And so I think, you know, when they make the case that, oh, these are retcons or they've changed too much, you can't really look at Bobby Drake and say there's a whole lot that changed by making him gay, you know, except that we don't have to ask now, when is he going to be outed?
Yeah, I think also when we were preparing for the show, Gabriel and I were talking about this, like this retcon thing. I think retcon doesn't really apply to LGBT characters because, like, people are in the closet in real life and come out and change and, like, reevaluate their relationship to their sexuality or their gender. Like, people do that in real life, and that's not a retcon. That's not like, you're not changing something about the history of the character. You're giving the character a new part of themselves that sometimes, in the case of X-Men, I think it has always fit well. It has always fit with the character before. But if it doesn't fit well, that's not such a big deal, because some gay people don't have a story where you can say, oh, they're clearly gay. Like that doesn't happen always.
Mm-hmm.
And it's weird for me that people complain about that people complain about retconning characters as LGBT. It's explicitly weird for X-Men because all the X-Men that have come out as LGBT were very much over that a lot of times. So it's like it makes sense in that way.
Yeah.
But it would be weird with any other character coming out, because it's like if they were in the closet, maybe you didn't notice. Or if they didn't know that, because people don't know that sometimes. People get old and get to their 30s and to their 40s and don't know that about themselves and discover it. And that's something that also happens and that needs to be told.
Yeah. The idea that it's a retcon, like Duna said, that it's changing some aspect of them when it's really not. The example me and Duna were talking about in the chat was no one is up in arms about the fact that Boom Boom is suddenly fluent in Russian out of nowhere. No one is saying, hey, that's a retcon. It's just like, oh, okay, so she knows Russian. And I think that it should be the same response to someone coming out as LGBTQ, because oh, it's, Bobby still went out with every single last bad relationship he had. That hasn't changed. Just now there's a new level of depth to it that they didn't include beforehand.
Well, I mean, we've been able to see them change reality completely, and that's okay. You can completely change reality. Spider-Man gave birth to himself, and that's fine. But Wolverine saw some guy walking by and was like, hey, that's an issue. That's definitely more about, the reader or the commenter than it is about these people as characters.
Okay, we got 2 comments. One, I accidentally dissolved for a second. We got a bunch of comments from Cody and Ross and Snoop and a lot of people from usually here, this side of the wall. And Cody called me out because I said people get out in their 30s and that's not that's not getting old. Sorry, it's just it's arriving to me, the 30s. So I'm like okay. And the other comment, I'm glad about this one because it's the character I was going to talk about. I was going to talk about a character that was my favorite explicit LGBT plus X-Men character. And Ross said, why don't we talk about Mystique? Ross said, is Mystique as an explicit character? And I'm going to break down Mystique because I have been reading a lot of Mystique. Not for this show especially, but I'm doing an article on trans characters on Marvel and DC. And I think Mystique is a really interesting case. I think she's definitely, we all know she's definitely LGBT in the case that she has had romances with both men and women. So that's it. That's says bisexual. That's no doubt, and that's canon, and that has been canon for a while. Even before the kiss with Destiny, and even like if you somehow, for some reason that I don't understand, don't count when Mystique says Destiny and her are lovers, I don't know why. Even if you don't count that, in the 2000 and something, Mystique ran, she kisses with a girl, with another girl, and she's pretty much into it explicitly. So it's like, this is not something, this is all over Mystique. But I'm also making the case that Mystique is trans. And my case is mostly because we don't know the assigned gender of Mystique. There's no way of knowing it because there's nowhere in the story where it says she was assigned a girl. There's nowhere in the story where it says she was assigned a boy. In fact, Claremont mostly hinted towards Mystique as an assigned male at birth person, as a person that was assigned a boy or forced into a boy role and then decided for her form to be as a woman. So like that was a thing that Claremont did a couple of times. That was like hinting at Mystique being like having a rough childhood and a childhood in where I don't know how to explain it because there's no way to knowing who her parents are. There's no way at all. But that was something that was hinted. That was like a part of Mystique's story that was only like referred to very tangentially. But anyway, without knowing the assigned gender of Mystique, which I think is not important, we don't know it. Mystique is pretty much gender fluid, and she's comfortable with both presenting as male, presenting as female, and presenting almost any form. And that's something that I don't know how to say it, but like for me, it's important that this character is trans and that they somehow in the future break down that mold and call it explicitly that. Because I feel that this is pretty much a trans story. It's a story about gender fluidity. It's a story about sexuality fluidity. It's a story about someone deciding what shape they want to be. Like pretty much in a lot of Mystique's appearances, it's clear that she has decided that that's how she wants to present with the world, like blue and like visibly mutant. And that's just something powerful that people sometimes take out of Mystique. Like a lot of narratives around Mystique is like she just has to suffer this form. But that's not true at all. Like when Mystique is unconscious, a lot of times she's like shaping with the environment. Or she's like the color of the environment. That happens a lot. So like she's kind of choosing her form. And I think that's a powerful statement of Mystique, and that's why I love Mystique. And I'm gonna add the note that Mystique is a character that also has had a lot of problematic, like, not only she's a villain and she's very cruel and she's like the embodiment of queer coding, but also like queer coding for people watching, if you're not familiar with the term, it's like you doing villains only queer people, so cause queer villain, like doing that thing. But also like she pretty much has used the tricking men into murdering them, tricking men into presenting as a beautiful woman or as another woman. She has done that a lot of times, and that's a trope that I think it's tiring. It's really, I think it's really toxic for a lot of trans issues. So I think Mystique has a lot of problematic stuff in the text, but at the same way, I think she's a great character in that way. And I think that's one of the characters that I want to see as trans representation moving on. Like, that's my point.
Going further with Mystique being problematic, one thing that I've noticed is that, and I don't know if we were planning on getting to this later in the show, so cut me off, but when it comes to bisexual or pansexual characters in the X-Men, they're all pretty much just problematic or brushed under the rug. Yeah. As far as I'm aware of, there's only 5 bisexual or pansexual X-Men. You have Mystique, who, like you already covered all the problematics. You have Daken, who uses his sexuality to murder and or potentially sexually assault people. You have Prodigy, who has not, until X Factor launches, he has not been on an X comic with a sufficient role since he came out. And then you have Deadpool and Psylocke, or now Captain Britain, who, aside from Psylocke's relationship with Cluster, they've not mentioned it ever again. And most of Deadpool's references are jokes and off-the-hand comments anyway. So there's not much significant bisexual or pansexual representation at all in the X-Men.
Isn't Shatterstar pansexual?
I forgot about Shatterstar. You're right. He's the one that they do right.
X Factor one, Richter had a very difficult time accepting that.
Shatterstar is the exception. You are right with that.
He's the one that did it right. I love that quote.
When Phantom Menace was first debuted, and it was a very subtle, low key, but he was obviously bi. He's flirting with both. The entire thing with Cyclops, which was pitched as a straight, they wake up in bed after they drink thing with him, Wolverine and Cyclops. And instead, we just cut to them, being in the secret base. But once the original writer went away, once Grant Morrison went away, you saw that turned more and more into just a very, especially with the Max series, it's like very straight male fantasy kind of thing. And all of that went away. And it was so.
Go ahead.
No, it's just like that hit me in a very kind of deflating way to have somebody that was, at least kind of out there. He's definitely a problematic character, I mean, he's a thief. He's full of shit, but that it could be that, and then it going in that other direction so abruptly was. Yeah. Go ahead.
The thing about Phantom X that blows my mind is the missed opportunity, because they end up revealing that we always knew he had 3 brains, and one of the brains is female. So for the majority of Phantom X's existence, wouldn't he have fallen underneath the trans umbrella, because he is bi-gender. He's both male and female. But they never reference that.
Well, he also has a female nervous system. I mean, it's still part of your body, even though it's external. So even from the ground up, that was built in, where he's definitely, you're dealing with 2 bodies, but still a male-female character.
I think Phantom X will be a good way for a trans author to come and write a trans story in the X-Men. And Mystique. Look, I've pointed at her. I think we really need to Mystique as a transgender fluid or trans feminine, trans woman, but like with all those nuances character would be a really good thing that, as people had pointed out in the comments, I have seen a lot of comments about that, Claremont always is like, I intended to do that, but that is not explicit. So it really takes away the powerful weight. Like it shows in Mystique's story that it's on purpose, that they didn't show what gender she was assigned at birth. So that's something that writers should like introduce in the story if they want to ever do a trans Mystique story that is not always about the changes of Mystique. But Claremont didn't do it explicitly. That it was hints, like always. I was thinking about that Gabriel said about bisexual characters, and isn't like Kitty Pryde the most like mistreated of those stories, because she was supposed to be with so many characters. Like she was queer baited with a lot of women, and then nothing really paid off. The only story where you can say like Kitty was attracted to a woman that was explicit or was like attraction on pollen, and they never kiss, they never make it explicit anyway, is the mechanics with Karma. But it was such a like not paying attention run, like something that really they struggled, put the carpet, and it's like, no, that about Kitty, we're not gonna talk about that again. And I think that's a big problem with the X-Men, because like we need like not only LGBT writers writing the stories, but also like acknowledging the way in which doing these characters in such like little ways, like not doing explicit queer representation on them, really hurts the story a little bit, because it's like it really doesn't arrive to where it needs to. Like in X-Men The End, I have been reading it these days, which is a weird book, and it was like a very catastrophic book. Rachel and Kitty are married, and I understand it. I read it and I'm like, they're married. It's here and here and here. But I understand how someone can read the book and say, well, I don't see it. And that's kind of the thing. Like, we need things that everyone can see, not only people that in that moment relate to the comic in that certain way.
Well, I mean, in Claremont's, his excuse or his reasoning with The End, when they asked him a couple of years ago, was, well, we have to think about Mormon readers in Utah. And I'm like, were you thinking of Mormon readers in Utah when you were writing books about teenagers in their underwear every other issue? Because that was New Mutants for like 6 years. But the minute it came to that particular marriage, that was his excuse, was it's Mormons in Utah. And I feel weird because like my favorite out gay character in X-Men overall is Bling. And I couldn't tell you when Bling was confirmed, specifically as gay.
Second issue,
because I mean, from the first issue when she's introduced, it's obvious that she's gay. The way that she deals with men versus women, her crush on Rogue, it's one of those things where it's hinted, and we're so used to the hints, but I had no question there. There was no, I wasn't waiting for the out. It was just, well, that character's gay.
Yeah, so I just did an article, and it should be coming out, I think, soon, where I actually was looking up all of the when these characters came out, and there's a couple of the newer ones that came out where it was hard to pinpoint exactly when they actually said it. So Bling was one of them. She came out her second issue where she admits she had a crush on Fox, who was Mystique, and Noel was another one where he was clearly gay throughout his entire run, and he actually didn't come out until one of those handbook issues, the 198 files, and that's how they out Noel in a little text box, because it's just something that everyone knew. And then like a year later, he came out on panel, and everyone said, "Yeah, we knew that." And same thing with Hindsight in the Generation X series recently. They don't say it until the series is almost done. But the romance that he has with Tim and Morph is so blatantly obvious. It's kind of like, we don't know that.
We've been known. Okay, so now I'm gonna switch to get more into the subtext theme, the characters that are mostly understood as LGBT plus with very, very valid reasoning, but never come out, never, or not only come out, never kiss with her character, never saw attraction in an explicit way. And what are your favorite ones? This would be a weird question because I'm asking favorite, but you can say favorite most frustrating or something, but like whatever you want. Who wants to go first?
I'll go first. So as far as favorite goes, to me, and I don't know if this is just me and my craziness of my head, but Sunspot gives off the strongest bisexual energy I have ever seen in the comics, and I would love it if they just casually dropped that he's been bisexual this whole time. And I think that is such an opportunity to make Sunspot bisexual, but leave Cannonball straight, and kind of show the kind of bromance that straight and queer people can still have despite the different orientation. And I think it would be great if they made him bi, but have him and Cannonball still just be bros. But I think the strongest case for me is Storm. Storm has essentially had a girlfriend in the comics with Yukio that they never flat out said, but just make it happen. It's there. We know it's there. Just say it.
Yukio and Storm are definitely girlfriends. I was gonna go for that one too, because like these are those panels where Yukio's holding a Storm like hand right here, right there, and it's going like I don't know what I would do if you die, and Storm is like, well, don't worry, because I'm not gonna die, love. And it's like that. It's exactly like that, and you're looking at it and like, why people say Storm is straight? Like, why? What's the case for that?
Well, I mean,
where do you see straight Storm? That's not a thing.
Well, you can show those panels to some people too, and they will say straight out, like, no, straight friends hold each other like that. And I'm like, if you really believe that, that's really in your life, like.
In one of the panels, Yukio has the lips open, and Storm is like this close.
It's a like, fade to black kiss that's happening right now. Like the panel ends and they're making out. It's a thing.
It's like, why people think that? What do they do with their friends? Like, sorry, but it's kind of gay.
I mean, I guess speaking of like embracing characters, I have a whole spiel on why Deadpool I think is my favorite of the characters, who is just not, they really haven't given him the chance to commit to the whole pansexuality aspect. But I just had it pulled up. If I can just pull up there it is. there's a panel between in Wolverine Origins from Daniel Way where him and Wolverine are kind of going at it, and they end up killing each other basically, and they're waiting on their rejuvenation factor to kind of kick back in, and it's almost a race. But this is how they end up dying in this really awesome embrace.
Yeah.
And it was one of the moments where I didn't catch it the first time. Right over my head. And going back through it, I thought, oh my gosh, they're in this amazing embrace that Wolverine's looking up with a nice exhale and Deadpool is dying facing down. There's been so much subtext with Deadpool, and unfortunately in the movie it translated almost as queer baiting because there was so heavily with his girlfriend, and then the jokes that you got of like him fondling Colossus, or like my favorite at the beginning when he's like discussing Wolverine's balls. Like to start the movie on that, I was just like, yes, like so good. But then they didn't really follow up with it. And but in the comics, it's kind of like that. There's always this back and forth, and I think it just happens. In all of my instances of this, Wolverine always pops up, so I always find myself talking about him because I've also got the racy Wolverine 6 cover of Without a Glare of the beer bottle, which basically serves as a visual point in the image that you can kind of, take from there and run with it. But they're sneaking these things in, and I think like Wolverine always finds his way into those situations, and come on, that's always with that, and that's where all of my characters that I love are, because I'm just like, why? There's always like the struggle of them getting out and just latching onto little comments and panels, but still fun. Like Deadpool definitely for the win.
We got a comment from Ross saying that he always wanted Gambit to be confirmed as bi, and I think we all wanted that too. James Asmus was like, let me do it. And the editors were like, no. And
Gambit's who I was going to bring up. So I'm glad I'm not alone in that. But yeah, I can easily see Gambit being bisexual. Like, no question.
I think he has flirted with men, and also in one of Cena's comic that is not Iceman, but is the Uncanny X-Men Winter or on something like that. That comic, Winter's End. In that comic, I think it's that one. I don't know if it's that one or one of Iceman's comics. I don't know. But in that comic, in one of those comics, Gambit explicitly says to, I think it's Northstar, that if Kyle is single sometimes, he's just free, and that happens. But they don't follow up in the story enough to us having a really compelling arc of, well, we now know because of this arc, and we see this character grow, that Gambit is bisexual, is confirmed, and we have this wonderful queer story about that, which is what I think we want.
And Fabian Nicieza, when he did the original ongoing, and he said he tried to out him, and they said no, and so he would have to go through plot mechanics, so that if you kind of do the math on character relationships, he definitely dated a few guys that are in that series. But you have to read from this panel this piece of information, from this panel this piece of information, and then you're like, oh, okay. And so it was a way that he could do it, but it's still not really doing it. At this point, is there anyone who doesn't think that Gambit is bi, though?
It's just like Storm. What are you reading that you think he's straight? It doesn't compute in my head. Yeah. But we still need it on the panel. Yeah, it's 2020. We shouldn't be having to read through the panel to find queer people anymore.
Yeah.
And I think with Wolverine, there's also that strong thing that a lot of writers have tried to get him with Nightcrawler, and it's like such a close relationship. Like, I was talking with Nick about that, and I was like, we have this comic in Marvel Presents that is called Male Bonding, which is about how they would both die for each other. That is the message of the comic. And I don't know how straight people can look on that. I know why, but I don't compute it and be like, yes, this is two bros going beer drinking. And
They have like such a weird relationship because I've been going through it. I think it's in Uncanny 183 when he brings Mariko to the X Mansion and he's introducing her, and then Nightwing kind of pulls a sly thing and starts like being a bit more suave, and Wolvie lashes out. And I'm sure people just see that as him like lashing out to protect who he's introducing, but knowing the history and like chemistry with him and Nightcrawler, there's way more there. Like there's something else happening in that, and there's a lot of those moments where they're such emotional intensity that I think what Gabriel said, it's more romancy and less broy. That's it hits on that so much.
I also wanted to make a point for Magneto in this point, because I feel like Magneto is such a I think his relationship with Charles is obviously homoerotic in a lot of books, and this is not only a Claremont says so point, but it's more of a they hold hands, they kiss their faces. That is so on panel. I know it's healthy for straight men to do that, but that's not what happens in real life a lot. So and they also call each other like the best of friends I ever have. They do this thing constantly where they're approaching each other from a very intimate point, and at the same way, in the same time, they disagree with each other profoundly, and I think that's a great relationship that should be explored more in that way. I think it was such a clever cast to put Ian McCain as Magneto for the movies, because not only because he's a gay man, but because Magneto embodies that he's one of the few mutants that are front page, that are protagonists, even if he's a villain most times, that are protagonists, that are center, and that are both oppressed and explicitly oppressed in a way that is not a mutant, and fighting for that also, not only for mutant rights. And I think that's great. It also was a thing that changed a lot because Magneto was retconned a lot of times to be Roma or Jewish, depending on the story. An Holocaust survivor anyway, but depends on the story, he's retconned as a different ethnicity, which is kind of weird, but he always has this thing of being a explicitly oppressed mutant. That I think it would be great if they went with the whole Charles and Magneto thing in a way that's so it really got a story, because it's always have this tension that they also sleep together a lot of times, that in the same room, that is so too. So it's
I love Chris Claremont has been open that one of the reasons he wanted to make Magneto have more depth and add this backstory was that before he ever came on, I think he might have been an assistant to somebody at the time, but wasn't writing a book. Roy Thomas and Neil Adams did the first time that Magneto has his helmet off, and the X-Men don't know who he is. And he's this super handsome guy. And that's how Claremont puts it, is this guy was so handsome, he can't just be bad. And that's going into Charles.
That's so pretty.
Someone didn't say that. I was that's why Charles forgives him every time.
Did it again.
He's just too pretty to stay mad at him.
But look at him. He looks so good.
It's a little bit you're distracting me with all your evil stuff.
So, for me, my favorite not fully outed characters are Rusty and Skids. And Rusty and Skids, to me, played that's the perfect bisexual couple to me. Even when I was a kid, they both had this tragedy. They've got things going on. But Rusty's origin, so to speak, they take him to a hooker to get laid, and he has this sex panic over this woman and causes a fire, and then he's ashamed. That felt like a not coming out publicly, but a coming out to himself kind of deal. Skids comes in and she's with Rusty, but she was constantly talking about how hot the women were, how hot Jean Grey was. And it was like right there on panel. And so for me, I've been waiting, my whole life basically for that to kind of get some play and to be more out in the open. And instead it's they're dead. No, they're not really dead. Well, now they're this, But I'm still waiting. Everybody.
I never thought of that till you brought it up, but I hope Krakoa gives us a bisexual disaster couple, because now I'm in love with that idea.
I mean, they brought everyone back, and yet no one we wanted, like all the queer relationships are denied. That was really weird to me. Like, we did this whole story about how everybody's back now, and then they're like, but Mystique, you can't have somebody. And, we're still waiting on North Star and his husband. We're still, all these sort of things. It was a bizarrely straight reset.
Now that we're onto it, I want to ask you all, holding on to Travis' question, before we get into the bizarre straight thing about X-Men that every time they go with the subtext thing, about your faith romance, LGBT romance of the X-Men. Because I think that also talking about romance, it could be an explicit romance if you want to.
Can I just go ahead and start with Wolverine and Nightcrawler, since we touched on that one a lot? Come on, make it happen already.
We want Greg Rucka back, and this time Greg Rucka has to write it.
Nobody.
Go ahead.
I actually really like the idea of the Xavier and Magneto relationship. I mean, it's not confirmed, obviously, but there's definitely something there, more than just mutual respect. And we used to be tight buddies. I mean, there's some tragedy there too behind them, and it's always played to me a little bit like somebody that had a bad breakup, but they still care about the person very deeply, and they can't quite let them go, no matter how unhealthy it is to maintain, even the shadow of a relationship. So, because so much of the X history hinges on the Magneto Xavier crux, I got to go with that one.
I'm going to go very simple, and it's Bloke and his boyfriend. And, it doesn't end up well, but just seeing a couple in an X book holding hands in a park and kissing, and I'm going to go off to do this superhero gig, that was huge. And it's insane that was like 2001, and we don't get another X kiss. We don't get another queer kiss for a long time, right? So that, to me, like, that's still something that is a touchstone for me.
I didn't hear who you said. I'm sorry.
Bloke from X-Force when it changed over and then became X.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
And so
Yes.
it's
Fun
our first explicitly gay kiss in an X book. And it's a very short, he's very short-lived, because everybody in that comic was very short-lived.
Right.
But it was such a big thing for me at the time to see that I still have a lot of feelings about that. Like, I'm still very invested in their relationship, even though he's been dead for 20 years.
As far as favorite romance, I'm trying. I don't have one. Victor and Shatterstar will always have a soft place in my heart, like I've mentioned earlier. And on reread, I'm realizing that I actually really, really dig Morph and Hindsight. I wasn't a big fan of Generation X when it first came out, but doing the article, I reread it, and their natural progression was just done so well, and also gave a little bit of the queer straight boy bromance with Morph and Kid Omega, if you believe Kid Omega is straight, which is something that is a whole nother conversation. but the way they progressed was just done really well. But as far as implicit, I think Kitty needs to grow some courage and resume the almost relationship she had with Karma, because before Pirate Kitty, Bartender Kitty was the best Kitty ever.
Okay, I'll go. I agree with the Kitty Karma one. I think that's a really good one. And I think they have a lot of chemistry, but it's like in one page, there's a lot of chemistry. It's very well written, and then there's nothing. And they always write it like that, and it's very. But I will go. I obviously think a very important one is Mystique and Destiny. I think it's one of the most important ones because it's a gay couple that grows old together, and it's also an open relationship, and those are two things that don't show a lot in comics, and I'm glad they kind of make it more forefront and more explicit in the recent years, because like we all knew it, but it was very difficult to find explicit pages of that. And I also, personally, this is like a personal one, I would love to see Liana get a girlfriend sometime soon. And I would go for Leah, like in the Secret Wars thing, because I think there's a very interesting story there about alternative realities and falling in love with someone in different realities and trauma and the things they share. And I think that was a clever romance. Leah of Asgard, I think it's Loki's cousin, and Iliana. And I think that's a really great one that was extremely short-lived. It was like 2 pages, or 6 pages into issues in a very short run, but I was like, this fits the character so much. I don't know, I'm of the club of get Iliana a girlfriend. And now moving on, because we have been a lot of time with characters. If you have any favorite run that comes to mind, and I'm gonna take this question because maybe you don't have a favorite run. I'm not sure I have a favorite run, to imagine runs. Like also if you have something that you think needs to happen. And while you think about it, I'm gonna turn on the lights because I have been dark again. It's recording.
A run I would recommend is that Generation X run, because it has the morph and hindsight romance. It has bling, and to this day, no one can seem to agree on if she's dated Mercury or not. No one seems to know. It's a maybe thing. And then it has Kid Omega, which just radiates queer, even though it's never said. And then you have Nature Girl, who to me reads as very asexual. It is a very, very queer run, even though it's not as explicit as I would like. It does have very much high queer energy. And as well as, even though it's not X-Men, the second volume of Young Avengers, where almost everyone is queer, and Prodigy, who is an X-Men, comes out in a very well done way where he relates his powers to his sexuality. But as far as runs I wish would happen, I desperately want Steve Orlando on a Richter and a Shatterstar series because of how he did Midnighter and then Midnighter and Apollo. I think he does the perfect line of realistic queer representation and the grittiness that should be in a Richter and a Shatterstar book.
I could definitely get behind that. I mean, Steve Orlando, just awesome writer in general, but yeah, get Richter and Shatterstar together. Let's roll. Let's see what happens. I don't have a particular favorite run for LGBTQ representation. So I mean, a lot of what you brought up, I'm just going to want to have to read myself, or possibly reread to take one of our comments from Mike Eakins and throw it out there. It's like, wait a minute, maybe I wasn't paying close enough attention to some of this stuff. Travis, what about you?
So, I mean, I think Marjorie Liu's astonishing X-Men run would be a big one for me. And she got so much criticism. I remember when that was coming out, and people were mad that she got to do the North Star marriage, or that she started adding all these characters in. And I think she had, very much things she wanted to talk about and wanted to deal with her run. Another one would be the Morrison New X-Men. There's not a huge amount explicitly, LGBTQ in there, but they dealt with Beast saying he was gay, and they don't dial back on that the way it seems. They confirmed that he hasn't had a sexual relationship with another man, and they stop there. There's not a "you're not gay," which, that's at least something. It was a development that way. You had Cyclops in that run when he's getting rid of his baggage. It's not just his costumes coming out. It's Jean Grey's, Marvel Girl skirt coming out of his bag and stuff. Morrison is a transvestite and has talked about that, publicly and openly. And I think there's a lot of gender stuff going on and a lot of trans stuff going on in that run that was kind of just under the surface. But it's still very emotionally valid, at least.
I feel like I'm going to have to join in on Matt here and say I need to, I've been taking notes through this episode myself on things that I need to add to reading. Duda's explanation on Mystique being a story of fluidity, I've got to do a deep dive into Mystique because a lot of that has seriously gone over my head. And I understand the importance or the prominence of appearance in that way, but never really the internalized process that she's taken on it. And super interesting stuff. I got to check it out. But for recommendations, I guess I would just recommend the Extreme X-Men run. Too many people don't think Wolverine's going to kiss Hercules, and people think that's like fan fiction or something. Like that happened. There's also
someone did a drawing.
Yeah, no, it's real. But they also it's a different take because Cyclops is a black man in it and is in a relationship with Dazzler. So there's some great interracial chemistry happening there, and there's just a lot of stuff going on in that series that I think it's worth having on anybody's shelf.
I want to point out we definitely want John Boyega for Cyclops in the MCU. That's something that got proposed by a lot of people, and I want to back up on that.
Yeah.
Also, because if we have revolutionary Cyclops, but not being a white man, it's gonna be awesome in a movie.
Yeah, here for it.
I think I was just thinking of Fallen Angels too. Fallen Angels was part of X-Men, but it really they went all out on that, and I think that's why the second series got started and then didn't happen. They were very clear, like Chance. And I've talked to the writer and artist about this since. Chance was a young girl who was, I think, definitely NB, definitely non-binary, and mistaken for a boy at times, mistaken for a girl at times, and very upfront about that she just was, who she was. You had other characters there was constant attraction between everyone, including stuff with Sunspot in there in the very beginning when he's with the New Mutants and he runs away to join these fallen angels. It's a very gay moment in ways that are kind of hard to explain or extrapolate, but the way that the characters are relating to each other, there's definitely erotic tension between same-sex characters as much as there is different sex characters.
It radiates queer energy. It just really does.
Yeah.
I don't know what I'm gonna recommend this one because I'm not really sure. I know a lot of people don't like this one, but I like a lot Iceman by Sina Grace. I think it's great. I have read a lot of criticism, but I think it's great because it's a comic that explicitly focuses on queer issues a lot in a very profound way. I think it really helps that there's a lot of scenes with the parents, but they're not explicitly like very traumatic. There are scenes that you can relate more in a level that you read them and you're like, well, I have had this uncomfortable dinner. I have had this uncomfortable chat with my friend. I think there's a lot of there that is very real and that is very about observing how people do things. That I think it's a very like, I don't know how to say it, but I think it's thoughtful. It's very like think about what you write, and I like that a lot. And also, this is gonna be weird because I'm like criticizing context all the time, but I think the New Mutants Volume One, especially the second part with Louis Simonson, was very subtext. It had nothing explicit, so it's not like you're gonna get a very explicitly queer story, but it had a lot of comparison to queer stories and a lot of parallelism to queer struggles. And also, it had a lot of very cute moments between, for example, Danny and Rane, which I talked about at the beginning. They hold hands, they kiss their heads. It's very cute. Like, you get this feeling like you get like they're gonna date, but it's not happening at the end. And they just found out, thanks to Travis the other day, that Louis Simonson was dating a trans woman by that time, and I didn't know that at all. And I was like, oh, I had this wrong idea about this like old writer that must be straight and doing all these queer subtext, but it's really wrong ideas, and it's more probably about the editorial part, like, than anything. But I don't know, it can get frustrating to read New Mutants Volume 1 if what you search is LGBT stories, but it can also get to, I don't know, find something in it that you want to build on it. I think most characters in that run have a lot of queer subtext that, in the case of Karma, was explored later, but in the case of the others, we're still waiting.
I think the New Mutant should just be queer people in Cannonball and just have him be the token white cishet guy who just supports everyone, and that's what I want out of my New Mutants.
That was U.S. Avengers. It's like the whole team was gay, and then there was Cannonball, whose wife is on the other side of the galaxy. I want to recommend like New Mutants. I want to recommend like early Excalibur because they were really homoerotic, but they're also really problematic, especially when you deal with Kitty, who is very young in both of those. And the other, the New Mutants are very young, and they really are in their underwear a lot. There's a lot of sexual aspect, which when you're a kid and you're reading that, I think it's actually very healthy for kids, to see that and to have that. But as an adult, and also, knowing that there were adult readers at that time, because as a kid, I didn't think there's also adults reading this. And, at some point you become aware, like, oh yeah, there's adults that were reading that and they're still obsessed, and so it makes it hard for me to recommend those, especially to general readers. Like to comics readers or superhero readers, it's a little easier because they know they can filter that or they can acknowledge that there's a problem. But to new readers, it makes it hard for me.
I do want to backtrack a little bit to Duna bringing up Iceman, because I've seen a lot of the criticism, and I've also seen a lot of criticism coming from queer X-Men fans because they feel that Iceman came out of the closet and became a stereotype. But that criticism makes me angry because it kind of pushes this narrative that there's a right way to be queer. When you have an out gay man writing the comic, obviously he's drawing from authentic experiences, and criticizing it because it's not your brand of gay, I feel is very narrow-minded. Because we can have gay characters presenting in different ways. So I think criticizing the way that he's presented, it angers me.
Yeah. With Deadpool and Cable, when they had their series together, I remember the arguments that certain scenes were not romantic or certain scenes weren't queer would be like, well, it's a joke because he's wearing bright colored clothes. or it's a joke because he's looking at him and there's hearts floating around them. And it's like, that's not really an argument, against it. But for certain readers, that's all it took. It was too gay, and so it must not really be gay, kind of thing. And I think
a lot of Deadpool's like sexuality has been behind that humor, and they've brushed it off like that. But it's so overt, like it's so, like you said, a lot of Cable in Deadpool is very homoerotic. Because there's no getting around that.
And I think Iceman, the series, kind of had that same response from some people, where maybe we're too used to hints and nothing but hints, or they're just homophobic.
One of the two.
Yes. I also got recommendations. We also got from the comments. We got X-Force Ecstatic, that Travis said too, that Peter Milligan's run, and Ultimate X-Men, which is a weird book, but Beast and Colossus were in there together.
Yep, classic and North Star.
It was a weird book because it also has like incest and all the things, but never mind. It has cases, and 1,000. I don't know how to do numbers right now.
1602.
1602, and that one because Angel has a boyfriend. I think that's a really.
So I actually did read that. Jean Grey disguises herself as a man underneath the name John Grey, and Angel falls in love with John Grey. And if I remember correctly, once he finds out that he's actually a woman, he kind of loses interest. So it's kind of like the old, the Disney Mulan movie, if they really buckle down on that concept.
I wish John Grey was just trans in this one.
Yeah,
it would fit better.
Yes, agreed.
I read it a long time ago, and I remember part of it. But yeah. Now that you tell me like that, it's like I wish they were going all the way with that.
Commit,
right? Like in Mystic and Destiny, I talk about them all the time. But when Mystic says form, and she kind of like is comfortable with presenting as any gender, Destiny is also comfortable with that. It's like a very healthy relationship with that. Like your partner is gender fluid, and you're like, well, that's fine. I think that's great to portray. And also we got Alpha Flight of the recommendations. What were you gonna say, Gabriel?
I was actually gonna comment on that as well, because I was never a huge Alpha Flight person, but North Star coming out was just iconic. Just made a big difference in the LGBTQ community. He was the first out X-Men character, and I think the first out Marvel character, I believe.
Yeah.
And Alpha Flight, I know, went back and forth with that. They almost had him have AIDS, and then instead he had a weird fairy virus that he had to go away to get cured, and then they just agreed to never talk about that ever again, and they finally outed him. I think that it is an iconic run as far as queer X-Men go.
I also wish that we got for looking at the future, and that connects with the next question, like what do you want looking at the future? And I think about that while you talk about that. But I also think we need more stories of coming out versus being outed, because we got a lot of the stories of being outed.
Yes.
And I'm needing of some monologue that is like, I'm gonna come out to my friends, because I haven't seen that a lot on Marvel. What do you all think we need moving forward?
As far as coming out, I kind of want something a little bit different, and I want it to just be established. So I mentioned Sunspot before, and I would love it if it's just Sunspot is bisexual, Sunspot has been bisexual. It just never had anything to do with what was happening on panel, so we don't know it, but everyone else knows it. Like, it just is something that is. I also think that we are in desperate need of explicit trans representation in the X-Men. and the fact that we don't, and like Mystique, like Phantom X, we have all these almost without actually it being put on the panel, I think is a serious problem.
Well, I think, going a little ways back, when Warren Ellis was on Excalibur, Rain had already had kind of this trans energy, this trans kind of connected, metaphor. And an assistant editor had changed words in a panel, and they called her a werewoman. And Warren's response on one of the online things at the time was like, well, if you wanted her to be transgender, there you are. They've confirmed it, and there's nothing they can do to take it back. And, people at the time, I remember comments getting mad at him and all this, because he used to troll the hell out of people online. But that stuck with me. And it stuck with me to the point where when her death happened, like last year or 2 years ago, and that was so badly handled that was the first thought I had, was that had come up before, and now they're going to play this out. And, so there's a lot of room, I think, for characters who've been established to just say, this character is trans, or this character is intersex. One thing I loved that Claremont picked up on in the end is that Cassandra Nova isn't really Charles' twin, right? She made a body out of part of a twin, or out of part of rejected material, but it's just Charles. And so by the end, Cassandra and Charles are having the exact same responses, the exact same moments, because it's the same person. Mm-hmm. And you could do something with that now and just make that explicit. This is a man in a woman's body, or that Charles is bigger than the sum of either of those parts, and deal with it. I think you'd have to have a trans writer to do it, or somebody's going to have to be, connected in that way. Kate Leth has talked about her time at Marvel, helping her to come out as non-binary. Other writers have talked about, working on a comic and realizing something about themselves. And so it could be that way, or it could be somebody that's already out and aware. But I don't know that somebody that's not connected is going to have enough interest in doing it, really push it in a real way and say this character is trans.
Sophie Campbell said that she wanted to write an X-Men run in Twitter various times. So she just needs the platform, but she said that. And Madeleine Bisayo wrote on a one-shot that is sad that she only got a one-shot. But yeah, there's a lot of trans writers that are doing things right now, and I know that there's a trans writer involved in X-Men, which is Vita Ayala, and is doing Children of the Atom, and I'm pretty sure we're gonna have trans characters there. But I also want to see sometime a story of a trans woman written by a trans woman in the X-Men, because I feel like a lot of the stories of the X-Men have piggyback on the idea of the end story with Cassandra, or a lot of runs with Mystique piggyback on the idea of having a character be a threat, because they're they have layers and they pose as beautiful women, and that has been played in Marvel a lot. Yeah. And I think it would be a good chance to have actually a trans woman come and write a trans character, a woman that is a trans character. And I don't think it necessarily has to be a new character. Mm-hmm. The Mystique part is complicated because it's a character that has been villainized a lot, so it's complicated. I think that's a very challenging thing to do. But I think a lot of characters that are now in the X-Men could come out as trans and explore the purpose of themselves by a trans writer.
I don't know if any of you guys read it, the Mystique series, where she ran up against Steinbeck, who was a male mutant possessed by a female whose mutant power was to possess other women. and then she ended up stuck in the male body of Steinbeck, and that was the villain of the entire series. And even when I read it for the first time, it made me feel like they did something wrong, and it to me it just screams villainizing trans experience. And I've not been able to reread it just because it just fills me with this visceral reaction of no.
Yeah, I would say that if someone wants to read Mystique, please don't go for these solo runs. Like, they're awful. Like, go for Uncanny X-Men. Read Mystique where she appears in a set with where queer writers have written her, like in Uncanny X-Men it has happened various times, in Astonishing X-Men too, and go for the appearance of Mystique, not for the solo runs, because they're very heavily on that like that villain, or like it's very on the nose. And I think that's part of the problem. When I said before that Mystique has been very problematic, I wasn't meaning like subtly so only. I was meaning like she has been a character that has been involved in very problematic stories a lot of times. And I also think Mystique deserves like poetic justice. That's why I think she would be a great character to make a trans explicit X-Men character, because like she deserves that poetic justice of having gone through that.
Well, I mean,
but yeah,
you know,
go on.
non-X mutant in Marvel, Typhoid. I love Typhoid. I love Annie Nocenti. I wish somebody other than Nocenti could write Typhoid what I view as correctly, which is that's a character who is, assigned female at birth, has multiple personalities that are all sort of stereotypical women, but they are very much drag personas. Those are not real women. When she's Mary and she needs to be saved all the time, but she's also manipulative in that. And me, when it's Typhoid and it's this kind of, dom kind of thing, these were affected. And it was a way to talk in the comic about how, not necessarily how women are, but how women are looked at, or how women are written, because these are written characters. They could do something with that. I think we're at a point, in 2020 where you can take that aspect on. And I think for anyone that has, any kind of, trans experience in their life, there are times where you code switch and you're doing this thing or you're doing this other thing, or where you're tamping something down or trying something out, right? And that would be a character where a lot of that could be explored. Instead, we got this crossover a year or two ago that was just generic villain. She set things on fire, she was cranky, and it was over. Which is unfortunately the same thing with Mystique, where I think there's a lot of fertile ground there. They're just not getting plumbed that way. They're not getting, we're not getting that exercised.
I'm gonna go to closing soon the episode, but before, I want to add a point to the Typhoid thing. I kind of like that character in a very complicated way, because I think the dissociative identity disorder is not portrayed very well in Typhoid, and I wish people didn't use it for other things. Like, I don't think that's a very great idea, in the way that I wish that mental illness was portrayed in comics as it is, not as a resource for putting out other ideas. But anyway, I like that character. I in a very complicated way, I was very drawn to that character. So it has a point of like, this is a very interesting character, but like, I think people could face those kind of issues directly in the eyes. Like, if you're gonna do a trans character, like, face the fact that you're gonna do it, and try to embrace the fact that if you're doing it, either you have experience with that, which would be the ideal point, or you do a lot of research. Because I think that would be a very good thing for X-Men moving on to have, but we need to have it right. We need to not repeat, like, have things like Mystique or Phantom X, where it's almost, I love Mystique, but I love it with a broken heart. So like, That's kind of the thing I want moving forward. And I don't know if anyone has any other final thoughts.
Yeah, if I could just plug something I would love to happen. They have not mentioned Deadpool and the whole Krakoa incident. There's no Kelly Thompson started a new #1, and I haven't seen any connective tissue to what's going on there. Maybe it's time. What's up?
I think she is going to in the upcoming issues of Deadpool. I think he goes
Really?
to Krakoa.
Oh, no way! Finally, I've been like complaining about it, and she put him as like the king of monsters, and I was like, oh, what is going on? But like, can we get maybe a Steve Orlando written series about confirming his pansexuality or something and tying that into Krakoa?
You're giving Steve Orlando a lot of work.
Going back to the work of giving Steve Orlando, I forgot to mention the other half of the creative team. In my idea dream, when he's writing the Richter Shatterstar series, I want Nick Robles on art because he draws such amazingly gorgeous people, and I need him on X-Men ASAP. Immediately.
See, I want to give Phil Jimenez a book. I want to give Roberta Gregory a book. Those can be the 2 X books. We have so many people that we choose that are the kind of, the front runners or the showrunners right now. They're not bad writers necessarily. I'm not saying they're bad writers, but they choose kind of the plainest person, and it's usually the straightest person in the room. And that shows. It doesn't matter how many, queer or artists of color that you hire separate from that. If who's really running the show is straight white guys, we can tell. So I'm hoping in the future they'll open that up some more.
Throwing out a name that may not be known much in the X-Men fandom because he doesn't do comics. There is a YA writer called Adam Silvera, and I hope I'm saying his name right. And he recently came out with a book that is very comic book inspired called Infinity Sun. And he is a self-confessed comic book fan, and is a queer Hispanic writer. So I would love them to kind of go along the lines of what they did with Rainbow Rowell, where they pull in a YA writer to start writing on comic books. And I think he would do a great job on the X-Men.
I mean, DC's best stuff in the last couple of years has been a lot of the YA writers that they brought in, the YA novelists.
I joke in the Twitter of Mutant Watch that it would be a great book to have a teen New Mutants style teen book, teen X-Men book with Steens doing the drawings, because I think she's a great artist for doing that kind of cute stuff. Like we haven't had a lot of that very recently, and I think that would be super cool. And maybe some other way a writer doing the story. Maybe I joke with Ivy Noel because Ivy Noel Ware is the collaborator with Steens a lot, but any other writer, I think that would be cool. Like throwing that queer talent that is from our side of superhero books into superhero books always gets something interesting. And I think for closing this one, because we got like 1 hour and half, and we could go further a lot. We're gonna try to do another one by the end of the month, and we got a bunch of comments, mostly for Rose, saying that an interesting point that we touched on here, and we maybe could expand that, is that dropping hints has become the most like accepted thing in comics. Like the queer stuff is just dropping hints here and there, and it's not like very focused and central. And how that maybe could be because of the history of this happening again and again, even with queer writers. Like even with queer writers, even in the present, that we have a majority of queer writers in X-Men comics, it happens. It's just hints. It's not a main central story for now. Mm-hmm. And we could maybe, well, what was you want to say, Gabriel?
Oh, sorry. I was going to say we're seeing that right now with the Dawn of X titles with the maybe queer polyamorous relationships that aren't on panel but kind of hinted at panel, and it's all just hints, nonstop hints, but nothing concrete.
Yeah, I think we could touch on that in the next show, and maybe also more on authors, and I think we drop hints about that, about certain authors, but we didn't talk about a lot of queer authors that have passed through X-Men. So I think that would be an interesting point to have in the next show. Maybe now that we have almost all month to think about that, and and to do other things like Gabriel's marvelous list of X-Men, of X-Men. And well, thank you everyone for watching. This was a very long and heavy but great show, I think. And well, if anyone wants to say anything more before I close, go ahead. Or okay, I read the room. So this is the best way to end, with like a comfortable ending. Okay, we're as uncomfortable as the comics we're talking about. Bye, everyone. Have a great weekend, and we see you at the end of the month with another Queer X-Men show. And we take any like suggestions of the team. We're gonna be thinking about it. And bye.
Right.